So the article I will be speaking about today is "And One More for the Road, Commentary on the Special Issue on Alcohol and Eyewitness Memory." This article explored the relationship between alcohol intoxication and eyewitness memory, and it analyzed experiments exploring the relationship between the two factors. It analyzed 9 experiments and proposed 4 mechanisms that are demonstrated in these experiments in order to better understand the findings. Studying the relationship between alcohol and eyewitness memory is important because it gives insight into how cognitive processes are affected by intoxication, and it may help law enforcement use more effective techniques when asking intoxicated people about what they saw at a crime scene. So first, we will learn about each of the studies that the journal articles discussed. I'll go through, name the experimenters, give a brief overview of their procedure, and say what they found at the end of their study. Evans et al. Studied the role of delay and intoxication on witness suggestibility and encoding and retrieval. There were 3 groups: an intoxicated group, a group that was told they were drinking alcohol but were not, and a sober group. Either immediately or after a delay of 1 week, participants answered forced choice questions about what they saw, and one of these answers was suggested by researchers to be correct. Researchers found that with no delay, intoxicated people were not more likely to be suggestible, but with the delay in answering questions, participants intoxicated at both encoding and retrieval were more susceptible to suggestibility. If a participant was intoxicated during encoding, they were less likely to be accurate and more susceptible to suggestibility. The study suggested that it may just be better to interview the intoxicated person at the scene instead of waiting a week and interviewing them while they're sober. Gowrie-Lois et al. Used a reverse placebo design in which all participants drank alcohol, but not all of them knew they were, and they watched a mock crime in a bar lab. The consumption of alcohol, either knowingly or unknowingly, affected the number of correct details participants recalled, but not the accuracy of the things they were able to recall. The reverse placebo condition, which is the condition in which they were unaware they were drinking alcohol, performed worse in free recall than those who knew they were drinking. It is suggested by this study that those who knew they were drinking alcohol were more careful in their answers because they knew they were intoxicated. In the Flo et al. Experiment, females had to witness an interactive rape scenario in which they rated the actions of the male and female. They were asked questions after they underwent the scenario. It was found that moderate blood alcohol levels, meaning the blood alcohol content was 0.06% or less, did not lead to differences in the number of correct and incorrect details or susceptibility to suggestibility. Altman et al. Approached participants who had already been drinking and asked if they would want to participate in an experiment. The participants played a beanbag tossing game in which the game was interrupted by a confederate, which is an actor in a psychological experiment. They later had to identify the confederate from a lineup or a show-up in which the target was either present or absent. This experiment showed that when intoxication increased, quantity and quality of the information decreased, but intoxication did not affect the accuracy of the information given. In the Sauerland et al. Experiment, sober, mildly intoxicated, and moderately intoxicated individuals were asked to identify a confederate from a lineup with whom they briefly interacted with earlier in the experiment. Participants were asked to identify the confederates anywhere from 2 to 23 days later. The sober group and the group with a blood alcohol content of 0.06% performed with the same accuracy, while the group with a blood alcohol content above 0.06% performed less accurately. In the Mailer et al. Experiment, both sober and mildly intoxicated participants were asked to memorize unrelated word pairs. 2 tests were conducted, and the study concluded that alcohol affects the association of items, such as words, rather than just affecting a participant's ability to recall the words. Hildebrand, Carlin et al. Explored the influence of intoxication on the interpretation of intimate partner violence. There were 3 groups, one which was sober, one which was mildly intoxicated, and one which was highly intoxicated. Both groups that were intoxicated interpreted the woman more negatively than the sober group. In the Mons et al. Experiment, a sober group and a mildly intoxicated group had to perform a facial recognition task, and both groups performed with the same accuracy. In the Meinthof et al. Experiment, there were 3 groups, a sober group, a mildly intoxicated group, and an intoxicated group. all groups saw a bartender pour himself a shot, which is not allowed. When asked by experimenters if they saw any transgression committed, all groups were more likely to disclose a personal transgression rather than the bartender's transgression of pouring himself a shot. Therefore, this does not support the idea that people get more careless with what they say when they are intoxicated. After analyzing all of the studies, 4 mechanisms became evident. These mechanisms were supported in some experiments but not others. However, they provide a framework in which we can analyze the studies in a way that we can better understand them. The 4 mechanisms include the alcohol myopia theory, or AMT for short, disinhibition, hypervigilance, and metacognitive processes during retrieval. I will now define what each of these mechanisms are and whether or not they were supported in the previously mentioned experiments. Alcohol myopia theory is the idea that intoxicated individuals tend to only pay attention to central or salient details, which leads to the reduction and coding of peripheral details. This is because there is a reduction of cognitive resources due to the physiological effects of intoxication. Some of the studies support AMT, while others do not. Disinhibition is the reduced inhibition of intoxicated individuals, which leads to more liberal decision-making. Some of the studies analyzed supported disinhibition, while some did not. Now that we covered the first 2 mechanisms, we'll move on to the last 2. The third mechanism is hypervigilance. This is when individuals have believed they consumed alcohol, whether they have or not, and become extra vigilant during encoding to compensate for the reduced cognitive functioning due to intoxication. Hypervigilance does not result from the physiological effects of drinking and was supported in all of these studies above that examined it. The fourth mechanism, which seems to be the least examined out of the 4, is metacognitive processes during retrieval. An example of this would be those who had consumed alcohol were way more conservative when answering questions, and some indicated they didn't know the answer instead of just guessing. The chart on the left side of the screen shows which mechanisms were supported in the experiments analyzed by Jansen, who wrote the journal article. As you can see from the chart, there were some studies that supported alcohol myopia theory and some studies that did not, and that is the same case with disinhibition. However, every experiment that involved hypervigilance supported the concept with the findings of the study. Although there is a wealth of information, some of it is conflicting. All 4 mechanisms have been supported in some way, but there are weaknesses in the studies that are recognized by Jansen. If these shortcomings can be improved upon in the future, maybe the data collected about alcohol and eyewitness recall will be more accurate. These are some of the things Jansen identified. First of all, there were differences in dependent variables in some of the experiments. For example, there was an experiment in which words correctly identified did not vary from the sober to intoxicated participants, but the amount of words not identified did. Secondly, it is possible that alcohol is only detrimental at high levels. Many studies show that there was not a huge difference between sober and mildly intoxicated groups, but highly intoxicated groups often showed a deficit in performance on a number of tasks. Jansen also said that future studies should specify which type of stimuli is being processed in the experiment. For example, processing faces is pretty immediate, while encoding other stimuli could take more cognitive effort. The last thing Jansen mentions in terms of limitations is the fact that some dependent variables aren't sufficiently sensitive enough. For example, in a study in which people were found outside of bars already drinking, there was not enough people in the sample size, which could skew the data. There also obviously is always the limitation of going up to people in a bar and asking them to participate in a study because they may not only be intoxicated but have taken drugs as well. These findings are important because we know the weaknesses in the data and how to improve future studies. The more knowledge we have about this topic, the better law enforcement and police will be at handling intoxicated people at and after a crime scene to get them to answer in the most accurate way possible. As said before, this research has very important real-world applications. If eyewitness identification among intoxicated people could be improved, it's possible that innocent people would not be incarcerated, and we could incarcerate more dangerous criminals who would have previously gotten away with their crimes. Jansen does suggest ideas for future research. Besides fixing the shortcomings mentioned earlier, she also suggests that future studies should pay more attention to the amount of alcohol people are drinking. For example, some studies identify people as intoxicated even when the participants were at legal driving blood alcohol content levels. She also suggests distinguishing between stimuli that is immediately processed versus stimuli that takes more cognitive effort to process. In addition to this, she suggests increasing the sample size as well as studying the relationship between alcohol and emotional arousal, because she hypothesizes that emotional arousal could affect one's ability to accurately recall information.